We're in a classic King's Indian setup, and black's main idea is to prepare the f5 break. The knight gets in the way, so you move it, play f5, and then bring it back. I used to wonder, do we really need to waste all that time with the knight? Why not just delay knight f6 and play it only after f5? In this video, we'll look at how that may work, what do we do after f5, and what limitations it might bring to our opening repertoire. You can play this setup against both e4 and d4, since the first thing you do is fianchetting the bishop. White usually grabs the center, just like in the King's Indian, while black focuses on pushing e5 and f5, of course before developing the knight to f6. And that's the key to this approach, playing the King's Indian with 2 extra moves. If white responds with f3, well, that's where black's fairy tale begins. Just gain space on the king side, open the G or H file, and go after white's king. Alright, let's check black's options in this position. e5, knight c6, and finally knight d7. The first option is the most direct. We're politely asking our opponent to close the center so we can continue with our plan. For those wondering why we usually want a closed center to push f5, I've covered that in a bunch of other lessons, so I'll leave it open for you to share your thoughts or knowledge in the comments. But if white decides to exchange queens by taking on e5, that pretty much ruins our plan. It also messes up white's center completely. And for those of you worried about king's safety, with queens off the board, not being able to castle is not a huge concern. White might gain a tempo to develop one of their rooks, but that's their only compensation for having that big hole on d4. Now, let's get to business and see what happens when white closes the center, which is by far the most common response here. You'll notice that masters don't always go for an immediate f5, because there is a price to pay after e takes f. In the usual King's Indian, black happily recaptures with the pawn, gaining space and opening lines against white's king. But in those setups, black king is already safely tucked away on g8 or h8. Here though, white can go for queen h5 check and mess up our right to castle. I mean, it's still playable, but I've got something much better in mind. I'm not talking about taking with the bishop, because that only helps white to set up a blockade on e4. What I'm suggesting is delaying f5 until white develops their knight, blocking the queen's path to h5. In the meantime, we've got a few useful moves. Knight d7, knight e7, or a5. The only move we certainly don't want to play is knight f6. And I really like the move a5 here. It makes harder for white to push their pawns on the queen side, and also prepares knight a6, followed by maybe knight c5. And this setup really works great if we are planning to play f5, because white might try knight g5, aiming for knight e6. But with our knight on c5, that idea doesn't really have the same effect. Okay, so after bishop d3, knight a6, knight ge2, the threat of queen h5 check is gone, and now we can go with f5. If white plays f3, we go f4, and then knight f6. That's your classic King's Indian setup. And the engine already favors black. Provides the following line: g5, short castle, bishop d7, h5, g4. And just look at the position. It really speaks for itself. There are other ways to handle it too, like in the game between Alina Lamy and Dmitry Andreikin. Black went for knight c5, and the game continued with bishop c2, knight e7, short castle on both sides, bishop e3, b6, a3, f5. If white goes for f3, which is what they usually do, black's plan is to push the kingside pawns, open up a file, and bring in more pieces to deliver mate. Now in the King's Indian, white's bishop is usually on e2, helping to stop black's g4 break. And here it is on c2, which makes g4 much easier to play. It's also worth pointing out, when the bishop first went to d3, it was trying to make f5 harder to play. But that's already way behind us, and looks like the bishop lost its primary purpose. Well, another reason for putting it on d3 is to free up the e2 square for the knight, so white keeps the option to push the f-pawn later to f3 or f4. Otherwise the knight would need to move again to e1 or d2. Now let's take a look at what happens if we go for knight c6 instead, the line known as the Kotov variation. After bishop e3, e5, d5, and knight e7, we see that the knight directly supports f5. Well, white may still try to prevent it by playing bishop d3. Now if f5, e takes f, g takes f, queen h5 check, the move knight g6 won't help because the f5 pawn falls. However, this time black may take advantage of the dark square bishop's position and take with a knight. And that bishop is too valuable for white given the pawn structure, so they should move it back to d2 or even c1. For that same reason, even the engine's top move is f3. Black continues with knight f6, castling, then f4, followed by g5 and knight g6. And here, believe it or not, the engine suggests knight g1, which really shows how tough things are for white in this setup. Overall, the idea behind knight c6 is really good, but it can get tricky if white plays d5 right away. The knight goes to d4, and after bishop e3 you can either switch the game's character with c5 or stay within the King's Indian lines with e5. If you go with it, after trading the knights, white is a bit ahead in development, and your move f5 is still not that certain due to e takes f and bishop h5, which ruins your castling rights. Finally, the move knight d7. Perfect one against those players hunting for your hand to shake after trading queens and slipping into boring endgame. Well, no queens are exchanged here, but of course there is a certain drawback, as always. You see, here, our knight on d7 is blocking the bishop that's supporting f5. Well, sure, the knight is going to be moved to c5 easily right after a5, but this means that the knight is definitely moving again, and white knows that. Therefore, they won't develop the bishop to d3, but play bishop e2 instead, with an idea to later kick our knight with a3 and b4. Still, that's not a big deal, and as black, you can continue with the old plan, knight e7, castle, and f5. At lower levels, it really doesn't matter all that much what you choose on move 4, as long as you know the goal of the opening, push f5, then f4, and start attacking on the king side. However, you might wonder what to do if white decides to castle queenside. That's where an interesting idea for black comes in. In the game Gutierrez versus Granda Zuniga, black played e5 and then knight d7. It does look a bit strange that this strong GM is comfortable with a knight exactly there on d7. We had bishop d3, knight e7, bishop e3, castling, f3, f5, knight ge2, knight f6, h3, telling us that g4 is next, thus practically provoking f4. And after bishop f2, it does look like white has no interest in castling short. Actually, they're interested in moving the king to the queenside into the corner and then eventually break with c5. Black should respond before it's too late, and the best is gaining space on the queenside with c5. Not only does it physically prevent white's c5 break, it also potentially prepares the a6 b5, especially if white's king tries to hide on the queenside. However, white might keep the king in the center and seize the initiative by being faster with the queenside break with a3 and b4. In situations like this, black still enjoys a huge space advantage on the king side, and pushing the pawns forward remains crucial. There's no real danger to black's king since white is completely cut off from the king side. The h1 rook is purely defensive. In the game, the legendary Peruvian grandmaster continued to press forward, g5, h5, and knight g6. Later in the game, white decided to close everything on the queen side, leaving only the king side to play on. And this was a major mistake, as white's only real chance was to play on the queen side, regardless of position of their king. When playing the opening this way, you must be ready to handle situations where white's pawn stays on c2. In other words, you should get comfortable with systems like the modern or pierced defense. Alternatively, if you opt for 1d6 instead of fianchetting the bishop, you can steer the game into the Philidor or black lion defense. The good news is that in most cases, when your opponent opens with d4 and you respond with g6, they usually follow up with c4. This is because they're typically more comfortable with this type of center compared to the one that arises in e4 openings, where the c2 pawn remains on c2.